You were about to tell me an experience at Toronto?
Well, yeah, I don't, I really believe religiously in not, having a drink before you see a movie if you're working, because, you just don't want to be tipsy or falling asleep at a film festival. But there is this one theater now.
Which is already a challenge, just from the sheer amount of films you see and that you're so, right? And that you're fairly...
exactly. You want to be as present as you can for each one of them, and you want to treat each one of them fairly, which is to say treat them the same. But there is one theater now at the Toronto Film Festival. The way they have it organized, it's way out of the way. It's way up on Bloor Street. So, you have to have all this travel time to get there. And it's where they show documentaries. And I always end up there maybe once a festival to see, like, a music doc. And this one theater, they have this full open bar instead of along with the concession stand. And so for something like, the Janis Joplin documentary, I'll have a drink to watch that.
Right.
And it just kind of enhances it.
Sure. I think that Janis would want nothing less for you but to experience that.
Absolutely.
Right? Very good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for meeting me, and this is special. I'm glad to finally meet you. I'm not sure we've ever met.
Yeah, I don't think so. But it's nice to be here.
Thanks. The thing that instigated the whole thing is you have a new book. And it's called Movie Freak.
My only book.
Well, it's a good one.
Yeah.
Movie Freak: My Life Watching Movies, which is it's a memoir about your life in general, but maybe through the filter of your passion for movies, and that's kind of the continuing thread that runs through the whole memoir.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. Well,
not your hate of your mother, not of what other Freudian.
No, I mean there's some family stuff in there.
There is.
I'll even talk about why I wanted to bring that in there. But I'll tell you that what the genesis of the book was. I had an idea a number of years ago, and it was literally just an idea, and I couldn't do anything with it. I thought, could there be a memoir of the life of a film critic that would kind of take people inside that experience? Because I get asked a lot of questions about it, and I thought, there might be some curiosity to know what the life of a critic is like. And I had that idea when I was back at Entertainment Weekly, and I thought, well, I don't have time to do this anyway, because there are all sorts of journalists who have the ability to have a full-time job and write a book. I've always been in awe of those people. I don't know how they do it. I knew that I couldn't do it. So I kind of just put that idea on the shelf. After I left Entertainment Weekly, I was thinking, this literally happened within a couple of weeks after. I was thinking, well, gee, what am I going to do now? This idea came back. I thought, what about that memoir idea? But now it fused with something else. I said, well, what if I do a memoir about kind of an inside look at the life of a critic? And I also take a deep dive into the movies that have really obsessed me over the years. I described it after I landed the contract for it, the first month or so when I was telling people I was writing a memoir. I literally described it as, I'm doing a book that's kind of a fusion of memoir and criticism. And no one seemed to understand what I meant when I said that. More than once I got the comment, criticism of yourself? I realized I'm just going to stop saying that. It's a memoir. But I wanted to have a critical element
People
in
can't
there.
fuse those two things together
Yeah,
so
well,
easily.
the thing is, fusing those two things together was a bit of a strange thing to do, but there were kind of a couple of reasons why I wanted to do it. For one thing, I thought it would be fun to really look back at these movies that, came after the 70s. I mean, we have the fabled era of the 70s, and there are certain movies from, the 1980s that have taken on, sort of fabled classic status, like Blue Velvet or something like that.
Right.
But I thought, God, so many of the movies that I liked, even in the 80s, let alone in the 90s or after, are movies that I think of as extraordinarily great. I think they will take their place in the canon. But they're still doing that. It's a little bit fresher.
Sure. Right.
And I
Jury's
thought
out.
maybe I can sort of define in an almost generational way, kind of my canon and all that. But the other thing I thought about it is that if I want to tell the story of the inside look at the life of a critic, and I want to tell my story, I have spent my whole life so obsessed with movies and certain films that to talk about those films is really to talk about me. It is to talk about the substance of my life, because that's what I did. And I thought, let me fuse those two things together.
In a way, I could see it because I understand. Like, you're taking these two elements that are, in a sense, the crux of your identity: your past, all the things that led up to who you are now, and also movies. So you have your life growing up as a child and as a teenager, and so all the formative years, and then the movies part of it, which is something that's your blood,
Well,
lifeblood in a way.
The thing that I realized looking back at my life is that I kind of became a movie buff when I was around 17, older than a lot of people. I mean, some people fall in love with movies when they're 10 or something. But for me, it still did serve this very particular emotional need. I mean, I really came from a very problematic family. I feel like by the time I was coming out of adolescence, I was out of sorts. And movies just entered into it and became not just something I did, not just a passion, became my identity. I think that's true, obviously, for a lot of movie buffs, movie geeks, movie freaks. But I thought, I'd like to tell that story. I'd like to go deep into the way that movies can take you over in almost this borderline unhealthy way. I mean, where they're filling this need, they're filling this space inside you.
Okay.
That's what an addiction is, right?
Right.
It's not as unhealthy an addiction as shooting heroin or something, but in some ways it is as much of an addiction. It is filling that space inside you. And I thought, let me try to tell that story psychologically. Just look at that phenomenon by going back into my own story and telling the story of how I fell in love with movies and how, from the moment I did, they began to fill that need in that special way. I thought, gee, if I tell that story, maybe that will speak to people.
I kind of joked before about this Freudian aspect of a lot of memoirs and how, maybe that this isn't about you and you're hating your mom and all that. It was kind of meant as a joke. But there is a complicated relationship with your parents, specifically your dad, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe some of that gap you describe, are you referring to that in particular? Maybe a certain level of, if anything's off the table, let me know. But is it some sort of emotional absence that was there that you somehow, on some emotional level, achieved with the movies?
Well, I think you just said it. I mean, there was definitely, what I tried to describe in the book, there was definitely a quality, you put it very well, there was definitely a quality of emotional absence in my family. I mean, in sort of two ways. First of all, I had one of those fathers who was a classic sort of bad dad, in a way. I mean, it's not like I'm sitting here now saying I hate him or something.
I understand.
He died back in 2008, and, I figured out, and this is in the book, actually, that
yes.
I did love him and all that. But he was kind of a bully, very distant person. I learned years later, a philanderer. He was certainly just not present in the family, one of those absentee dads. And beyond that, there was just a quality of emotional distance in my family. It was not a loving family, not a lot of hugs, not a lot of uses of the word love, all that kind of stuff. And, I think any number of people grow up in families like that. I did. But it left me with hunger that I think I felt from an early age. And I began to fill that hunger with art and the love of art. Now, that sounds really like, okay, so what? Millions of people do that. But I wanted to talk about the particular way that I think this molded me as a critic. When I was a kid, we listened to a lot of classical music in my house, and I was also obsessed with pop music, and I developed the desire to play all this stuff.
Right, you had a natural ear.
I had a natural ear, right. And I taught myself to play the piano in one day because I heard the theme from Swan Lake, and I said, the key thing here is not that I had that ability, because plenty of musicians do. It was like I needed to play it. I needed to play the melody, and then that didn't do it. I said, I get it. What makes that so beautiful is the chords. I figured out how to play the chords. I was like really 7 years old. Though. And in playing that theme from Swan Lake that day, I felt like I wasn't just listening to the music anymore. I had entered into it. With, in a funny way, full sexual metaphor intended. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny, but I mean, there was a sense of consummation. I wanted to enter into this music. I wanted to possess it. And when I played it, I did. And that was fulfilling. And in a funny way, I did the same thing with movies. How do you enter into a movie if you're watching? Well, for me, it was through writing. It was saying, I want to be someone who looks at this film, enters into what it is, understands it from the inside out, and ultimately explains it, first to myself and then maybe to others. That's where the impulse to become a critic was. I mean, ultimately, I evolved a job out of that and all of that. But it began with this, I think, this deep hunger in me that I had as a child to enter into these artistic experiences as a form of connection that I think was making up for something I didn't have.
And nobody taught you this. This was just stuff that happened organically, right?
Well, I'll tell you, with music, it did happen organically. Mm-hmm. With movies, where it was taught to me was, by one person, Pauline Kael. I had never really read film reviews or even thought about wanting to write about films. Mm-hmm. My freshman year of college, I saw 2 movies in a row, bang, bang, that really made me a kind of movie freak 3.0, and that was Brian De Palma's Carrie, and then a month later, Robert Altman's Nashville.
Which remains your favorite
That remains my favorite film. I became obsessed with both of these
films. And when I was reading about, and I want to get right back to what you're talking about,
yeah.
but before I forget, I understand, especially with Nashville, because in a way, Nashville and many of the films of Robert Altman, one reason I connect so deeply with them as well is it's this immersive experience. You're in this world, cradled with all these plots that are going on, and there's a whole world there with all these nuanced characters, and you feel on some level like you're being taken care of almost when you're watching the movie.
Well, that's beautifully put. I think that you do. It is immersive. Another word I'd use for it is, and I think it underlies my aesthetic. Mm-hmm. There is a realism to it. I mean, there's obviously a realism to Altman's films, but in general, there is a realism, a feeling of authenticity to the films that I like, a kind of documentary quality, because I like to get caught up in the illusion that it's really happening. When I watch a movie like Sid and Nancy, at its best, with Gary Oldman just almost looking like he is Sid Vicious, you really believe it's happening. You believe you're there. Sure. That's the transcendent quality I'm always looking for in film.
Right, and the theatricality, especially in the dialogue of early films, or earlier films, I should say, from the post-silence, obviously, up to the 60s or the studio years, there was a theatricality to the language that maybe didn't turn you on quite in the same way. One can appreciate those films for many, many reasons, but they didn't quite create this obsession like the movies of the...
I think that's true, or a lot of people who become film buffs, naturally dive into the canon and have every bit as much love for classic Hollywood movies as contemporary ones. For me, I now really do have that kind of love, but it took me years, decades to do that because you're right. This sort of slightly stylized quality that Hollywood movies have, it just didn't allow me to develop that obsessive connection to them that I did to, the films of the new Hollywood 70s and what came after that.
We're talking to Owen Gleiberman, whose new book is called Movie Freak, My Life Watching Movies. You chose very specifically movie freak, not film buff. There's a sense of obsession around the movie freak, as that it does. Film buff is sort of just that person that makes a point of going to see all the new movies, but movie freak is something beyond that.
There was a documentary that came out a number of years ago now that I thought was a very good piece of work called Cinemania.
Oh, I knew you were going to bring that one up.
And the thing about that movie, it was interesting. It was about the so-called cinemaniacs. I see them around. I mean, I see specific people from that film around sometimes. And
I have to revisit it myself.
What's funny is that they seem, on the one hand, to be the ultimate movie freaks. They see more movies than anybody.
True.
They have their whole lives mapped out in terms of this screening, that screening. So at the end of the week, at the end of the year, they have seen more movies, and completely obsessively. So they seem to be the fulfillment of the kind of obsession that I'm talking about. But in another way, the impression I got from that movie is that these people, in some way, weren't movie buffs at all. They were more like stamp collectors. They were collecting these experiences. And it was all about cataloging and collecting. It was about saying, I saw 38 movies last week. I saw 1,800 last year, if you count the 700 revivals and all of that. And I feel like there was such an obsession there with literally this checklist in their minds that almost seemed more important than the actual experience of watching these films.
Good point.
The reason I called my book Movie Freak, and I got the title pretty early, and I think it actually determined something in spirit about the book, is that, there's other metaphors for being a movie buff. Patton Oswalt had that book out last year called Silver Screen Fiend, and in that particular phrase, I think all that title means is, fiend for the silver screen, fiend for movies. In my own case, I always meant this title to be a pun. it means movie buff, but it also means freak in terms of saying that I have felt something like a freak in my life. My particular twist on it is that there's something about that word that suggests, I don't know what, outlandish behavior or a certain kind of alienation. And I really did mean it, I guess in the freaks and geeks sense, that I am a species of geekus americanus. I have a pretty, kind of bland surface. I'm a geek, a dork, a nerd. That's where I fit in. And yet I wanted to write about how people like us can have the kinds of passions and obsessions and maybe dark obsessions and get into a little of the whole sex and drugs and rock and roll thing. That's such a driving current in the culture that we partake of those passions too. And I feel like that hadn't been given necessarily a lot of expression in books. So I wanted to talk about that.
There's also an element of, I don't want to say self-protection, that's not what I'm looking. Yeah, it is where you have an element of this freak nature, though, that's also able to create a career. For instance, you were at Entertainment Weekly for 24 years. You're now at BBC.com. So there is like an ability to also, unlike those guys that you were talking about, Cinemania, who I don't know how they make a living.
Right.
I'm not sure. Hopefully they're trust fund kids because, I don't know how else they're able to pull it off. And part of that is this one thing that distinguishes you is that element you referred to at the beginning of the conversation, which is your desire to tease out the elements that, of the film, of giving it time. You let it marinate. You think about it, the movie, how it affected you, why it affected you, etc. And then you want to take that and express it in a public way.
Right.
And that part of it, which also earns you your keep, separates you from what could have been a darker story where you were a cinemaniac, like those guys.
Well, I don't think I ever.
And I don't mean to. By the way, some of them. I don't know what their lives are like, so I shouldn't.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't think I ever would have been at risk of becoming that kind of person. I think if I had not ended up doing this as a career, I might still be a movie buff, but I don't think I would be doing it
quite
around the clock. But I guess in a way, my book is about sort of walking the line between being a presentable, functional person, which I've had to be as a critic, and having these kinds of private obsessions that drove me all through that, how it's sort of the light and dark sides at once. And I had never been able to express the dark sides of it in my work. And I thought, that's what I'd like to do in this book, to really show this is the kind of person that becomes a critic, and why.
It's a good way of putting it. We met at the Film Forum across the street from where we are now, where they're having a run for a Blue Velvet. I suppose it's a new print or something. But it was I also knew, even though I spent many years not in this industry, I was in the music industry, but I was at a screening originally when Blue Velvet came out in theaters in New York, and I went to see it. I guess I knew something already. Maybe I'd seen The Elephant Man already. That's possible. And I went in there, and I knew I was watching something really special. I was in the theater in Queens where I grew up, even though I had left home. I guess I had come on a trip home or something. People were laughing and making comments because they were uncomfortable with what they were watching on the screen, the audience. And so I walked out because I was too distracted.
Right.
I couldn't watch it and immerse myself. I knew I was watching something that was completely new and different and important, but I had to go, and I had to come back another time and watch it again. Anyway,
well, you're making me remember something I hadn't in a while, which is that back when it came out in the 80s, there developed this kind of cool hipster thing about Blue Velvet, that you marked yourself as a cool Blue Velvet fan if you said, I saw it, and I thought it was hilarious. I was laughing all the way through it. And, of course, there's some truth to that. There is a kind of discordant humor to some of it. There are funny things in Blue Velvet. But basically, this is not a comedy. And the basic experience that I would describe in watching it is that you really get sucked into it. It's almost a kind of meditative experience. I'm not laughing very much. But I think you're right that the almost over-laughing at Blue Velvet is, a function of people feeling uncomfortable.
It is, and in fact, with further thought, I now, with the experience of, and with having been now a middle-aged person with some distance there, I actually can appreciate that they were experiencing it in a very organic way, that audience, even though it distracted me, but I can understand their discomfort. It's David Lynch, and if you're not feeling uncomfortable by what he's doing, you're not getting him on some
But it's funny, one of the things, I talk about Blue Velvet in my book, and one of the things I wanted to talk about, this is a perfect example, is I didn't want to re-review Blue Velvet.
I understand.
But I wanted to talk about how it worked aesthetically, and more than that, I wanted to talk about why a movie like that meant so much to me. It's obviously, at this point, I mean, it's a classic film. It's brilliantly made, brilliantly original. It's dark, disturbing. It's all of those things. It's actually, on some level, I feel, in a way that people don't quite talk about it, a reinvention of classic cinema, because even though it is a visionary David Lynch film, it's a kind of film noir. It's almost like a Hitchcock film. And so in many ways, in terms of independent filmmaking at the time, it restored the pleasures of a certain kind of old-fashioned movie making, but in a very, very new way, obviously. But the thing I wanted to say about my own personal connection to it is Blue Velvet was, for me, and I think for a number of people who saw it, a liberating film, far beyond what a hypnotic experience it is. And that's because it kind of told you, if you were a person who had your own dark obsessions or dark attractions to sexuality, it told you that this stuff was okay, because it shows, you know, the Dennis Hopper character as this very, very dark character. I mean, not just because he's an evil bad guy who sucks on a gas mask and all of that stuff, but because he is, in a way, a prisoner of his own sexual obsessions. And in that first scene where we see him, it's possible to kind of just say, well, I got nothing to do with that.
Right.
But the whole point of the story is that there is a link between what goes on in the Kyle MacLachlan character and Dennis Hopper.
He's your avatar. I mean, Kyle MacLachlan is, in fact, coming from this very picturesque, innocent life and all of a sudden stepping into something quite dark. And his attraction to it is the scary part of the film more than anything else.
One of the things that I think Blue Velvet has in common with the great Hollywood, the great old Hollywood movies, the great film noirs, is that it all gets down to what we mean by this word love. In other words, there's a certain kind of dichotomized thinking we have in America where we say love is love, it's very wholesome, it's very passionate, and then you may be attracted to these dark ladies, the femme fatales. That's all about, in our view, sexuality, maybe the overpowering pull of dark sexuality, but it's not necessarily love. I think the film noirs were quite much more ambivalent about that. For instance, I've always felt that a character like the Rita Hayworth character in Gilda, or Lana Turner in The Postman Always Rings Twice, who's basically inspiring this guy to kill for her. I've always felt that those are true love stories. They may be dark love stories. They may be kind of twisted. What the guy ends up doing for love may not be defensible. But I do think it's a form of love. And I think that's there in Blue Velvet as well. I don't think the Kyle MacLachlan character is divided between Laura Dern, the girl he loves, and Isabella Rossellini, the dark lady he's attracted to. I think that the dark lady stuff and everything he gets involved there is presented as a form of love. There are different forms of love. Now, the one is unhealthy and destructive, and one that he maybe ultimately wants to kind of pull himself out of. But it is a form of love, and I think that's part of the power of the movie, that it acknowledges that that's a form of love, and that maybe even what Dennis Hopper feels inside him in that movie is some twisted form of love. It's all love. There's a spectrum, and that's part of the power of that film.
As I was reading, I definitely was seeing a lot of parallels, maybe just because we're maybe in the same general generation.
Yeah.
And so I was definitely relating to so much of what you're talking about in the book. You grew up in Michigan, right? And
I did. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that was very influential on me. I mean, the first chapter of the book, this isn't necessarily an Ann Arbor thing, but my parents, in 1967 and 1968, when I was 8 and 9 years old, my parents, really at the behest of my father, took us to see... Took me and my younger brothers to the drive-in to see these movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Boston Strangler that were hugely inappropriate for someone my age to be seeing.
Right. That's what it was.
And in a way, that kind of formed the bedrock of my aesthetic, because where somebody else might have been traumatized by this, I was fascinated. I was drawn right into the adult subject matter of these films in sort of a precocious way. And I think it instilled a lifelong feeling in me about cinema that almost the ultimate in cinema is that it's about giving you the feeling that the curtains are being drawn back on this forbidden world, and this revelation this dark revelation awaits you. I mean, I think it's akin in certain ways to the feelings that Quentin Tarantino has had about grindhouse movies. I think that's why he keeps going back to the 70s. I think it's about when he grew up. The 70s for him represented, this in that grungy B-movie grindhouse way, a kind of dark, forbidden world that's still his Garden of Eden. And I had my version of that in a little before him, because I'm a little older, in the 60s. But then, where Ann Arbor helped form me is I was a little too young for the counterculture. I mean, I was 11 years old in 1970. But I was surrounded by the counterculture, or the dregs of it, and I became very attached to it for a couple of years before I turned 13. The Chicago 7 became my heroes. Right. I would tote the transcript of their trial around. And
that was your Bible.
That's right. There was a lot of stuff about the counterculture I didn't like. There was a lot of liberal piety, but there was one thing that attracted me powerfully. This was an era where the lead countercultural voices were out there sort of trying to tell the truth about what was going on in the government, corporations, this kind of thing.
Certainly other truths than what was being fed us.
Other truths,
by
exactly.
The mass media.
And that was very big in Ann Arbor. And the aspect of the counterculture that I really revered was this idea that you should tell the truth. And that's something that, in a way, I carried into my criticism, because what I found about Pauline Kael, one of the many things about her writing that so attracted me, is I experienced her as a fearless truth teller, and that was just narcotic. And it's something that I believe in my own criticism. And to be honest with you, I don't think there's anything heroic about doing that. I think it's sort of square one for criticism, that you should tell the truth. If you're not in the truth-telling game, get out of criticism.
Yeah, there's other things.
But I do
politics.
think that yeah, right. I think a lot of criticism today, in many ways, is kind of weaseling away from the truth, more to a kind of collective truth. Here's what we think about this movie. Here's the movie. Here's the cool indie movie that we recommend. It's almost like, I think a lot of critics make movies more important than they are. They say, well, I'm just a critic. I'm here to serve the movies. That seems very noble. Well, no, if you're a critic, you're serving two things. You are there to serve the movies, but you're also there to serve your own version of how you see them. That's what a critic does. And what I revere is the notion of the critic as a powerful individual. I don't want to sound like an egomaniac when I say this, because I don't think that it means that you are some, monomaniac, but it just means you owe the reader being the full person that you are. That's what a critic is. And I find that these days, I feel like there is a lot of groupthink. There are a lot of people writing on film who might not be so willing to really put themselves out there. And I think that is a kind of shrinking away from what the job really is.
So it sure is. So while on the subject then, because you spent 24 years at Entertainment Weekly only to be pushed out 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago? I mean, and it seems like it was for the sake of the bottom line, right? I mean, do you have I don't know if this is something you can talk about.
I don't think so. I mean, I suggest in the book, a lot of people asked me when I was laid off from Entertainment Weekly, they said, well, why did this happen? I mean, it's hard for me to talk about this without sounding like I'm patting myself on the back, but people said, you were one of the best things they had going, or whatever. And I try to suggest in the book, I don't know 100%, but I don't think it was economic. I think that the magazine, even though I still think it's a really terrific magazine, the magazine had changed and evolved, and I think the powers that be looked at me and the kind of writer that I am, the kind of thing I was doing, and said, this doesn't necessarily fit in with where we're going so much. I think there was that feeling, and they may have been right.
Well, you certainly landed on your feet. How was the BBC?
Well, I think there was a big opportunity. They always say that when something like this happens, it creates opportunity.
Sure.
In a sense, I created my own opportunity, but I am not exaggerating when I say I literally got the idea to do this book within a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
and was already taking notes on it. And I knew that was an opportunity. I knew I couldn't be doing this if I was still at the magazine.
Did you anticipate that you were? Was it in the air? Was it something you knew was going to?
Well, I talk about this one sign, when the editor walked right past me. I mean, just a literal thing that happened that surprised me. When I had won an award in the morning and the editor walked right past me and did not say anything, like, congrats for winning an award for the magazine. And I thought, that did surprise me at that moment. I was like, that seems like it could be a sign of something.
Yeah.
But in general, that idea that they wouldn't want me at the magazine anymore did take me by surprise, because in my ego or whatever, they didn't know anything to me. They only owed to themselves attempting to have a successful business, and I thought that I helped the magazine. And I thought I was still helping it, and I blogged a lot. I really tried to kind of embrace online culture and loved it. I mean, I really loved blogging. I talk about that in my book, how when I started blogging in earnest in 2009, I mean, I'd written a number of posts before, but when I really dove into it, I just found it absolutely liberating as a writer.
It didn't run against criticism for you, or to opposite sides of the brain?
Absolutely
like
not. Okay. Blogging to me was a fulfillment of criticism, because every blog post I ever did, I mean, I enjoyed, maybe more than a lot of other critics did, writing posts that sometimes engage the business of movies, because I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah.
And Pauline Kael used to talk about that. If you go back to her very first book, her famous collection, I Lost It at the Movies.
Sure.
It has,
which you attribute, in a sense, with your first chapter, right?
That's right.
And, I Lost It at the
I think that's
drive-in.
become a kind of iconic title, and Tom Roston played off
Tom
it.
Roston and I Lost at the Video Store, yeah.
That's right. And I was getting to know Tom right when, I was finishing up my book, and I wanted to let him know I didn't rip the song from you. The idea of playing off Pauline's title.
He was on the podcast recently, too.
Yeah. He's a great guy, and I love that book. But what I wanted to say about Pauline's first book is there are a number of capsule reviews in it. She kind of goes through the history of cinema. And if you look back there, this is mid-'60s. This is way before there was Entertainment Tonight or Entertainment Weekly.
It wasn't right. This was not a category of some sort, or some sort of world of criticism.
Yeah, people weren't talking about the box office or anything. And yet, Pauline, in her capsules then, makes a number of references to, she'll say something like, this is a terrible movie, blah, 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 blah. But, it was a big hit. It just shows you that the public will fall for these tricks every time. And the interesting thing about that is you read something like that and you can say, oh, well, that's Pauline being a snob. It's saying she had this feeling.
She saw things. We attribute everything to Jaws and Star Wars, right? But she saw that coming, and you could see it in her writing like 10 years before that.
You could say that she's putting down the audience, but I see it exactly differently. Maybe she's putting down the audience a little bit, but what I say is she was willing to at least engage what the audience was doing and make that a feature of her criticism. That mattered to her. What people were seeing mattered to her. Yeah. To really be a snob would be to just write what you think and fuck what the audience thinks. We're not even worry about it. So I always was interested in what movies at any given time were hits or not hits. I wanted to talk about why. So in that way, in my blog posts, I often engaged the business of film, but I always found them to be critical. I thought it was a way of kind of doing criticism in a more expansive form, and a feeling I started to develop is that sometimes I would even write a blog post on a movie I had reviewed. Like, here's a silly example off the top of my head. I had to review that remake of Arthur that Russell Brand was in.
Sure.
Mediocre movie, and I said that the way that everybody else did. At that point, it had become official after the movie had as a matter of fact, here's how the box office comes in. The movie would have been bad even if it had been a hit, but it wasn't a hit. Monday morning, bad weekend grosses. And what that meant was that at that point, Russell Brand's little attempt to become a movie star was over. I wanted to talk about why, and I wanted to talk about my own journey with him, that when I first saw him in Forgetting Sarah Marshall, I thought he was funny as hell.
Yep.
My attitude was, who the fuck is this guy? He's great. He's a star.
Right.
But I discovered over the next few years that I got really tired of Russell Brand, and I thought that I had figured out why he didn't become a star. So I wrote a whole blog post on him, on why Russell Brand, though he is a talented guy, really had become kind of tiresome. That, to me, was my real piece of criticism about Arthur. Who cared about this movie? Who cared about this lame movie that just sat there and why it didn't work and why no one wanted to see a remake of Arthur anyway? That was really kind of uninteresting. But the persona of Russell Brand and why he was so funny for one moment and then became completely tiresome, that was fascinating to me. And that's just one example of what blogging let me do.
Right. Kind of dig into some of the nuances of around the margins in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's still are
that also that start to seem
talking
really
to there. I can't
start to seem the center. I mean, when you're
Yes.
really talking about, like I did, I did my version of an early reconnaissance blog. Some people,
Yeah.
peg it to this one movie, whatever it's called. I can't remember. Not the limo driver. What was it called?
Oh wait.
I can't remember. There's one McConaughey movie that was sort of the beginning. But for me, where I first tagged it was Magic Mike.
Okay.
His supporting performance there as the aging stripper coach,
Right.
of.
Yeah.
Because I thought he was so great in that movie. And it wasn't just that the terrific actor was revealed. It's that because he was playing a supporting role, and the guy who would have been Matthew McConaughey before was now Channing Tatum. That was such a perfect metaphor in that movie for what had happened to him. He wasn't the star anymore, but he was a great character actor. That, to me, was the story out of Magic Mike more than the movie itself. I actually really did like the movie, but the post I did on Matthew McConaughey was the thing that I was most interested in writing.
Interesting. Well, people should check it out. Where can they find your blog posts?
Oh, they're still actually around, those blog posts from Entertainment Weekly, but you can't call them up anymore. You just have to, know the subject or whatever. I don't know if there's any
You
place.
You can recall them. They can come up. But,
or I think maybe.
But
if
are you blogging?
If you click on my byline, I write occasional pieces for BBC.com that are think PC type things, but it's kind of harder to do that there. Right? It's more like straight on reviews.
Very good.
So I haven't exercised that muscle for a while, but I hope to in the future, actually, especially now that I'm done with this book.
Yeah, speaking of art, would you do another book? Is that something you would consider?
It's certainly something I would consider because I had a great time doing this one.
And
that was really my guiding thing. When I sat down to write it, I'm the kind of writer that I have writer's anxiety, like a lot of writers. I'm the kind of writer who is always happier to have written, and it's done, and it's Miller time, all that stuff. So, but when I was writing this book, I said, well, wait. If you sit down every day with the feeling that this is any kind of burden and you are actually lucky enough here to be able to tell your own life story, there's something wrong with that picture. So I said, you should have fun doing this. And that was, if I was ever in a mood where I felt like it was too much of a task, I said, either stop writing now or get in a different mood. And I kept to that. I did have fun doing it. And I said to myself, I think it'll be a more fun book if I have fun writing it. And it ended up being a very, very positive experience.
Good.
And I really liked just the daily process of writing a book. So I could see at some point maybe trying to do another one. I would be open to that. I have to find the right subject, though.
Understood.
It can't be the sequel, or maybe it can. I'm not sure how
Nowadays,
much there is left for the sequel.
Yeah, maybe a prequel. Maybe I haven't figured it out yet.
The toddler years.
Right. Anyway, again, Movie Freak is the name of the book. My Life Watching Movies by Owen Gleiberman, who you can read his reviews on BBC.com. And thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, Adam. Great talking to you.